She was beaten for saving an Apache, and he returned with 20 warriors to honor her. The church bell rang long before the congregation gathered, its iron tongue beating the morning silence into something crueler than a summons. And Clara stood at the center of the packed dirt yard with her wrists bound to the hitching post, shoulders bare beneath torn calico as sunlight exposed every bruise already darkening across her arms. Men and women circled her not with curiosity, but with the self-righteous hunger of people who pretend cruelty is justice when delivered publicly. The constable read from a crumpled sheet, voice loud enough to echo off washed-out storefronts. Clara Hensley, charged with aiding and harboring a hostile Apache male who trespassed on settler land. Punishment, 10 lashes, and public shaming. Clara clenched her jaw, not because she feared the pain, she'd survived worse winters and longer nights alone, but because the baby she once thought she might carry someday would never see her as anything but a rumor of disgrace if word spread. She stared at the dirt, breathing shallow as the crowd whispered, "Why would she help one of them? Maybe she's gone soft. Maybe she traded more than kindness. She wanted to scream that the warrior hadn't threatened her, hadn't demanded anything, that he had been bleeding, caught in a steel trap meant for wolves, and she'd simply refused to let a human die like an animal. But explaining mercy to people who prefer fear felt like trying to teach rain why it falls." The constable nodded to the man holding the whip, a broad-shouldered farmhand with a scar splitting his lip, eager in a way that made Clara's stomach twist. He cracked the leather across the ground once, letting dust jump, then raised his arm. The first lash struck with a snap that flattened the air, pain ripping across Clara's back like fire pulled through nerves. She refused to cry out, though her knees buckled, fingers curling into fists against the post. The crowd leaned forward with morbid reverence, as if pain were a sermon and they had come to worship. "You chose the wrong side," the farmhand sneered, throwing the second lash harder. Clara forced her voice out, raw but steady. "I chose the living side." Murmurs rippled, uneasy, not impressed. By the third lash, her breath came ragged, vision stinging with streaks of white, but she kept her head lifted because bending wasn't punishment. It was agreement. The fourth blow stalled in mid-air. A rider crested the ridge behind the church, horse trotting with regal calm instead of urgency. At first, he looked alone, a tall Apache warrior with braided hair, leather chestpiece painted in earth tones. But then the sun hit the ridge fully, revealing more silhouettes behind him. Not 2, not 5, 20. They rode in silent formation, weapons sheathed, spears upright like banners of bone-still discipline, not war. The crowd froze, not from guilt, but from the brittle fear of people who suddenly realize their version of events may not matter anymore. The constable reached for his pistol. "We don't want trouble here." The leading warrior dismounted without haste, boots touching dust as though he'd returned to land that never stopped belonging to him. He stood tall, expression unreadable, scar along his jaw healed into silver memory. Clara recognized him even before the wind carried his voice. "I am not trouble," he said calmly. "I am the man she refused to let die." The whip-holder faltered, glancing at the constable for direction. The warrior stepped closer, gaze locked on Clara, not possessive, not grateful, but honoring her refusal to look away. "Your anger is with me," he continued, "yet your punishment lies on her back." He turned to face the crowd, posture unyielding. "You beat the one who showed mercy, and mercy returns with witnesses." The 20 warriors behind him dismounted in silent unison, forming a half-circle that faced the settlers, not in threat, but in judgment. Clara's breath trembled, not from pain now, but from the weight of finally being seen. The churchyard emptied slowly, not in shame, but in that unsettled silence people carry when the world contradicts the story they've been telling themselves. Boots scuffed the dust, mothers tugged children away, men pretended they weren't rattled while watching 20 silent warriors stand like carved stone beneath the bright noon sun. Clara sagged against the hitching post, ropes cutting into her wrists, blood trickling beneath torn fabric on her back where welts rose in jagged ridgelines. The constable pretended to keep order, though his hand shook on his pistol, eyes darting between the Apache leader and the men who suddenly looked less like a posse and more like spectators caught in a lie. The warrior stepped closer to Clara, not touching her, not lifting her chin, simply stopping where she could see his face without bowing. "Your wounds are open," he said softly. She gave a bitter, breathless laugh. "So is this town." He glanced at the ropes, then at the men who had tied her. "May I cut these?" She hesitated. Every eye in the yard watched. If she let him, the town would say she chose them over her own. If she refused, they would say she was ashamed. There was no way to win, but suffering alone had never been the point. She nodded. "Yes." The warrior drew a knife, not a weapon, but a thick-handled blade strapped to his thigh, worn from real use. He sliced the ropes clean with one smooth motion, stepping back so she could stand under her own weight. Clara's legs buckled and she nearly fell, but she caught herself on the post, refusing to appear saved. The warrior watched with an expression that wasn't pity, something closer to respect that carried the weight of having been broken before. "You should rest," he murmured. "By the creek. My people have medicine." Clara shook her head sharply. "If I leave this yard with you, they'll say I belong to your camp now." His jaw tightened, confusion flickering. "Mercy does not claim." "Here it does," she whispered. He looked at the crowd still lingering along porches and boardwalks, the same faces that had watched her bleed without blinking. "Then I will not take you," he said, "but I will not leave you alone." He motioned with 2 fingers, and the warriors behind him shifted, not in attack but in formation, spreading out across the yard, positioning themselves in quiet half-circle to face the town. They did not touch their weapons. They simply stood as witnesses. Clara pressed her hand against her back, wincing as pain flared. She glanced toward the road leading out of town. Her small wagon sat by the trough where she'd left it that morning, half-packed with feed sacks and a cracked water jug. She could leave now, slip into the trees, pretend none of this happened. But she stayed rooted. Running felt too much like saying the punishment had worked. The constable finally cleared his throat, voice thin. "You've made your point. Move along." The warrior turned his head toward him, not hostile, but with the slow, unblinking gaze of someone used to deciding what words were worth responding to. "My point is not made," he said. "Honor is not breath. It must be seen." Clara swallowed hard. Why come back at all? Why this? His eyes softened. "Because I remember who freed me from the steel jaws. Because you placed your own hands in blood so mine could return to my people." He paused, voice dropping. "You returned me home. I return your name." Clara blinked rapidly, the world blurring. "No one here cares what I did." "They will," he said simply. "Or they will be small." Heat pulsed behind her ribs, not pride, not vindication, but a fragile spark of something like dignity waking from a long sleep. She stepped away from the post, standing straighter, despite the pain, Jonah long-forgotten dreams of normal life returning like ghosts. The warrior's voice lowered. "We will wait. When your pain speaks, we will listen." Clara turned toward the road and took her first step away from the whipping post, not to run, but to decide where she would stand next. The warriors fell into step behind her like a shield she hadn't asked for, but might finally accept. The walk to the creek took longer than it should have, not because the path was difficult, but because Clara refused to lean on anyone. Each step pulled the torn skin across her back, each breath scraped against bruised ribs. And still she held her chin high, as though dignity were something that had to be carried even when the body broke under it. The warriors followed at a respectful distance, their presence silent but immense, like shadows cast not by daylight, but by consequence. When they reached the water's edge, sunlight shimmered across rolling currents that cut through smooth stone, dragonflies hovering above reeds as though the world had no idea cruelty had been spoken hours earlier. Clara knelt slowly, cupping water in her palms to splash her face. The sting across her back flared like fire. But the cold anchored her to the present rather than the moment she'd been tied. The Apache warrior, she still didn't know his name, waited until she finished before stepping closer, kneeling on the opposite bank so they faced one another across only a few feet of rushing water. He set down a strip of leather-wrapped vials filled with herbs. "These are for fever," he said, "for pain, and for wounds that carry heat from shame." She dipped her gaze. "Shame doesn't bleed out, it sticks." "Not when others carry it too," he replied. His voice wasn't soft, it was factual, the kind of truth spoken by someone who had bled for things that weren't his fault. Clara looked up, and something in his presence pulled a memory from a place she'd buried so deep she'd convinced herself it wasn't hers. "You weren't just trapped," she said quietly. "You were unconscious." The warrior blinked once. "Yes." "There was a bullet in your leg," she whispered, "and metal in your shoulder." He tilted his head, studying her. "You remember?" Clara pressed her palm into the dirt, grounding herself. "I remember everything. You were caught in that steel trap with blood all over the snow. It was nearly dark. I didn't know who you were." "You knew enough," he said, but she shook her head, voice hollow. "No, I was scared. You looked like something wild and powerful and dying all at once. I nearly walked past, nearly left you there, thinking someone else, someone braver would come." The warrior's eyes shifted, not warm, not cold, just deeply present. "And yet you stayed." Clara swallowed, the flash of memory shattering across her mind. The trap jaws rusted and clamped around his calf. His breathing shallow, blood freezing in the crusted snow. She'd pried the trap open with trembling hands, metal ripping her palms, then dragged him into her wagon, cursing the weight and the world and herself the entire way. "I stayed because I couldn't watch a man die in the cold like an animal," she whispered, "not even a stranger, not even someone my town feared." The warrior leaned forward slightly. "Mercy is not born from strength. It makes strength." She let the silence sit between them, heavy as stone. Then she finally asked the question that had haunted her from the moment he appeared. "Why come back with warriors instead of alone?" His expression shifted, something like a shadow of pain crossing behind his calm. "Alone, I could thank you. With my people, I could change what they think of yours." Clara stared at him, stunned. He wasn't here to repay a debt. He was here to rewrite a story. Wind rustled through tall grass, carrying scents of sage and sun-warmed dust. She pulled her injuries tighter around herself, unsure whether to feel humbled or terrified. "They'll think I helped you for something," she murmured. The warrior shook his head. "They will think you helped because you are the kind who does not step over the fallen." He stood slowly, offering a strip of medicine across the creek. "You saved me from dying alone. Now I save you from being forgotten alone." Clara reached out, fingers trembling as they closed around the herbs. Not a pact, not an alliance, but a bridge across a history built on fear. For the first time since morning, she didn't feel like a woman who'd been punished. She felt like someone who had chosen something worth bleeding for. Clara didn't return to town intending to challenge anyone. She only meant to gather the things she'd left in her wagon before the punishment. The half-torn flour sack, her sewing kit, and the winter coat she'd dropped when they dragged her into the churchyard. But by the time her boots touched the wooden planks of the trading post porch, she could feel eyes crawling across her skin more painfully than the welts on her back. The porch boards groaned beneath her weight as she reached for the door, and the chatter inside quieted instantly, like birds silenced by a hawk's shadow. She stepped in anyway, shoulders stiff, head high. The general store, normally smelling of leather oil and ground coffee, now reeked of suspicion. 3 ranch hands by the barrels straightened. A woman near the fabric bolts clutched her child closer. The shopkeeper, Mr. Harlan, with his thinning hair and half-moon spectacles, froze mid-tally, jaw tight enough to crack. "You got nerve walking back in here," one of the ranch hands muttered, spitting tobacco into a tin. Clara ignored him, moving toward the shelf of salves and dry cloth rolls, but another voice cut in, dripping poison with confidence. "Heard she didn't just help that Apache," a woman whispered loud enough for half the room to hear. "Heard she sheltered him in her home, alone." "In her bed, more like," the ranch hand snickered, thumbing the brim of his hat. "Why else would a man ride back with an army if not to claim what's his?" Clara's jaw clenched so hard, pain shot into her temple. She set a jar of salve on the counter and met Harlan's eyes. "Just ring it up." He didn't move. "This store's for citizens loyal to their own," he said flatly. "Not traitors who consort with enemies." The word traitor hit harder than the whip. Clara leaned forward, voice low but steady. "A man dying in the snow isn't an enemy. He's just dying." Harlan scoffed, tossing her salve back into the basket as if it carried plague. "You could have brought him here, Could have told the sheriff. Instead, you hit him. Clara felt heat crawl up her neck. You ever seen a man in a trap? Half frozen, unarmed? You think your sheriff would have carried him to safety? You think anyone in this town would have looked at him and seen a human being? Silence tightened around them like a rope. Then the ranch hand leaned his shoulder against a post and smiled without warmth. Maybe you ain't human either if that's how you pick your company. The words landed like another lash across her back. Clara turned to leave, holding her supplies tight, but the doorway filled before she reached it. Two of the same men who'd held her arms during the beating, blocking her path like this was still a punishment yard. "Where are you going in such a hurry?" one asked, voice slow, dangerous. "Your new friends waiting outside town?" Clara's heart kicked, not with fear, but with a quiet, rising fury she hadn't allowed herself to feel before. "I'm going to wrap my wounds," she said, "and then I'm going to continue living." The taller man stepped closer, breath heavy with rot-gut whiskey even though it was barely noon. "We ain't done deciding what kind of woman you are." "You never got to decide," Clara replied. "You just pretended you had that power." Movement flickered beyond the open window. Shadows crossing sun, warriors taking quiet positions along the street, not advancing, just watching. The men stiffened, glancing outside nervously but trying not to look rattled. Clara pushed past them, stepping onto the porch where sunlight washed across her face in clean, fierce gold. Behind her, townsfolk whispered again, not with certainty this time, but with doubt, the first cracks forming in a story built too quickly. She didn't look back. Instead, she walked toward the road, holding her supplies to her chest, telling herself she wasn't leaving because she was unwelcome. She was leaving because staying meant letting their version of her become truth. And if there was one thing pain had taught her today, it was that truth deserved to walk in daylight. Clara hadn't made it past the last fence line before the first warning shot cracked across the prairie road, a rifle report sharp enough to scatter a flock of birds from a nearby cottonwood. She froze mid-step, instinctively shielding her ribs as pain lanced up her back, while dust lifted from the road in a faint brown plume where the bullet struck. The town's men were gathering like storm clouds behind her, 5 riders fanning out from the livery and another 3 posting up along the boardwalks, rifles propped casually, but eyes sharp with the jittery energy of men terrified of being exposed rather than harmed. Clara kept walking, refusing to turn around, but the sound of hooves thudding behind her drew closer, not fast enough to trample her, just close enough to press their presence against her spine. "You don't get to just walk out like nothing happened," one of the men called, reins jerking as his horse danced beneath him. Clara didn't answer, because answering meant acknowledging they had a right to speak. Instead, she stepped off the road, moving toward the tall grass like she belonged anywhere. The ground still felt honest beneath her boots. Another bullet cracked, intentionally wide, grazing the air near her right side. Fury rose in her throat, not fear, fury, because the same men who tied her up, who swung the whip, who called it justice, were now chasing her as though she owed them something for surviving it. She stopped walking. Slowly, she turned. The riders formed a loose semicircle in the road. One with a sheriff's star pinned, crooked to his vest, though he'd never been sworn in properly, just another man with power because no one had bothered to challenge him. "You're stirring up trouble bringing those people here," the fake deputy barked, rifle angled at her hip. Clara lifted her chin despite the sting of dried blood across her shoulders. "They came because I saved one of them, not because I asked them to fight you." A man with a red beard spat in the dirt. "A woman's place ain't between tribes. A decent person's place is between suffering and those who let it happen," she shot back. His jaw clenched, and he kicked his horse forward half a step in an attempt to intimidate her, but before he could speak, movement rippled across the hills to the north, shadows shifting between sagebrush and rock, not hoofbeats, not settlers. The warriors had followed. 20 horses descended the slope with quiet precision, not charging, just riding in a staggered formation that made them look like the land itself had decided to walk. The lead warrior, scar along his jaw catching the light, guided his horse to Clara's side but did not face her. Instead, he stared directly at the armed men, posture calm enough to make their trembling reins look foolish. "She walks where she chooses," he said. 2 of the riders swallowed hard. The fake deputy puffed his chest. This is our road. The warrior's eyes narrowed just a fraction. Roads do not belong to men who bleed them with fear. The red-bearded rider raised his rifle higher. You don't give us orders. I give none, the warrior replied, but I speak truth. He turned slightly, voice carrying across the road like sand dragged across stone. You beat a woman for saving a life. Now you threaten her for refusing shame. Clara felt the air shift, settlers stiffening at how plainly he named what they'd done, warriors tightening their formation as though ready to stand between worlds again. The deputy snapped. We don't need outsiders telling us what's right. The warrior leaned forward in the saddle, eyes sharp with centuries of dignity that couldn't be whipped into silence. Then show rightness without being told. The words struck harder than gunfire. Clara exhaled slowly, shoulders trembling from pain and something like rising strength. I'm going to the creek, she said quietly. I'm going to tend my wounds, eat bread, breathe, and continue my life. If any of you follow to drag me back, you won't just be wrong, you'll be seen. She stepped forward again, and for the first time, the riders parted to let her pass, not because they respected her, but because 20 mounted witnesses made their cruelty suddenly less righteous and more cowardly. Behind her, she heard the warrior's horse fall into step, not guarding her, not claiming her, just keeping pace like truth had decided to walk beside her now. The creek's edge welcomed her like a place untouched by accusation, sunlight catching in ripples that danced over smooth stones while cottonwood leaves trembled overhead, whispering secrets to the wind. Clara knelt on the bank again, this time unhurried, rolling up her sleeves and dipping a strip of cloth into the cool water. The sting across her back sharpened as she pressed the wet cloth against torn skin, breath hitching, but she did not wince aloud. Pain felt like the last thing she could keep private in a world that had taken so much. The Apache warriors arranged themselves in a loose perimeter around the clearing, not guarding her, but forming a silent boundary that let her bleed without spectacle. They faced outward, backs to her, watching the edges of the prairie the way men do when they have no interest in being feared, only respected. The leader, scarred jaw, steady voice, dismounted and joined her by the water, kneeling with deliberate space between them. He placed a small pouch beside her. For infection, he said. Clara nodded, opening it to reveal crushed goldenroot and willow bark dust, the smell sharp and earthy. Thank you. She sprinkled it across the wounds carefully, fingers trembling, not just from pain but from the weight of having someone treat her suffering as something worthy of care rather than punishment. For a long moment, they said nothing. The creek babbled, wind stirred grass. A hawk circled overhead. Finally she spoke, voice wary. They won't forget this morning. The warrior dipped his hands into the water, washing dust from his palms. Nor should they. You think public scars are justice? She asked, bitterness creeping in. No, he answered. I think silence is worse. Clara studied him. The calm certainty, the disciplined stillness, the way he never filled space he hadn't been offered. Do your people know you came back for me? They know why, he said. Some agreed. Some did not. She paused, surprised. Why would anyone disagree? The warrior's gaze drifted to the horizon, where the hills rose like folded memory. Helping you could tie our people to yours. Some fear your laws will twist mercy into ownership. Clara flinched, not because she disagreed, but because the truth had teeth. That sounds like something your people have seen before. His silence confirmed it. She lowered her eyes. I don't want to be a symbol. Good, he said. Symbols are easy to break. Humans are harder. The comment disarmed her. Before she could answer, one of the warriors at the edge of the clearing whistled sharply, a signal. Horses rustled through the brush. Voices approached, multiple, hurried. Clara stiffened just as 3 men from town crashed through the grass, rifles raised, not the earlier riders but younger men, faces flushed with the kind of fear that looks like bravado. There she is, one shouted. We ain't letting her hide behind them. The warrior stood smoothly, not reaching for a weapon, only positioning himself between Clara and the threat. This ground is neutral, he said. It can stay that way. The tallest rider scoffed, gun trembling in his hands. We just want to talk to her, alone. Clara stepped forward before the warrior could speak. You had your chance to talk when you tied me to a post. The young man hesitated, glancing at the line of stoic Apache behind her. The warrior spoke again, voice low. If you seek truth, speak it. If you seek vengeance, go back to your mothers. A ripple of embarrassed anger crossed their faces. One lowered his rifle, another swallowed hard. The last spat in the dirt but retreated. They left without firing a shot, not because they respected her, but because they finally understood they were outnumbered morally, not militarily. When the brush stilled again, Clara exhaled shakily. They'll come back, the warrior nodded once. Then we will return with them. She turned toward him slowly, eyes burning. Why? He answered without hesitation. Because no one should stand alone where others use fear as their law. Clara's throat tightened, pain shifting, not disappearing, but finding somewhere new to rest. She dipped her hands back into the water, letting the current pull blood away like the past loosening its grip. The wind shifted by late afternoon, carrying clouds across the sky and slow drifting sheets that softened the sun without dimming it, and Clara found herself walking alongside the warrior toward the prairie ridge that overlooked the town, not because she needed protection, but because something in her wanted to see from above what had once tried to crush her. The warriors followed at a distance, their horses moving in disciplined silence, creating a formation that looked less like an army and more like a traveling truth that refused to be hidden. The ridge rose gradually, scattered with sagebrush, and when they reached the top, the view spread wide beneath them. Cabins, dirt roads, church steeple, smoke from cook fires curling upward like nothing had changed. Clara stood with the wind pushing her hair back, arms folded gingerly so the torn skin on her back didn't stretch, breathing in a horizon she hadn't been certain she'd ever face without flinching. The warrior stopped beside her, gaze fixed on the distant rooftops. They prepare, he said. Clara followed his line of sight. Men gathered near the blacksmith's shed, passing rifles between them like children trading secrets they didn't understand. But not all of them looked ready to fight. Some paced, brows furrowed, fear etched across their faces. Doubt had finally entered the town. They think we mean war, Clara murmured, voice sad rather than angry. The warrior shook his head. They think war is the only language they understand. She sighed, exhaustion settling like stone in her chest. Doesn't matter what I say. They already decided who I am. Then do not speak to convince them, he said. Speak to remain yourself. She turned toward him, studying the scar along his jaw, the calm steadiness in his stance, the kind of strength carved from surviving rather than conquering. What's your name? She finally asked. He glanced at her, eyes warming by a fraction. Toka. She let the syllables settle on her tongue like something earned. I'm Clara. I knew, he said softly. She blinked, startled. How? Toka's gaze drifted to the horizon. You said it once while pulling metal from my leg, thinking I could not hear. You cursed at the cold and said you refused to let Clara Hensley be the kind of woman who left a man to die. Clara's cheeks heated, embarrassment and pride colliding. I didn't think you were conscious. Pain often hears what pride does not, he answered. Before she could speak, another whistle echoed from below, the signal she'd come to recognize as alert. The warriors tightened formation, turning their horses to face downhill as a small group of townsmen approached the ridge, carrying a white cloth tied to a wagon wheel, spoke instead of weapons raised. Clara stiffened, not trusting the gesture, but Toka stepped forward calmly, his posture neither open nor defensive, just present. The group stopped several yards away, dust settling around their boots. One man, a balding store clerk with trembling hands, cleared his throat. We, came to talk. Clara crossed her arms, ignoring the pain. Last time you came to talk, you brought rope. The clerk winced. We didn't know the full story. You didn't want to know, she replied. A heavy silence followed. Then the clerk spoke again, voice small. Did he hurt you? That Indian? Toka didn't answer. Clara did. The only men who hurt me were the ones from town. The statement landed like a dropped anvil. Several men shifted their weight. One lowered his head. Another clenched his jaw in shame rather than anger. Toka finally stepped forward. We return at sunrise to speak truth where all can witness, not in hills, not in shadows. Bring your voices then. The men nodded, retreating slowly, leaving dust trails as they descended the ridge. Clara exhaled, shoulders loosening. "Tomorrow changes everything," she whispered. Toka's expression didn't shift, but something in his eyes did. Resolve sharpened into certainty. No. Tomorrow reveals what was already true. She watched the town shrink into the distance, and for the first time since she'd been whipped beneath its church bells, she didn't feel cast out. She felt ready. Sunlight broke across the town like a clean blade the next morning, sharp and bright, brushing the rooftops in pale gold as Clara walked toward the churchyard, the same place where her blood had dried in the dirt less than a day earlier. She moved slowly, but not weakly, wrapped in a simple shawl that hid neither scars nor posture, every step measured like she was reclaiming the ground beneath her rather than merely crossing it. Behind her, the Apache warriors rode in a quiet procession, their horses walking in even strides, spears upright and untouched, presence heavy with meaning rather than threat. People gathered in clusters along porches and hitching posts, whispering behind cupped hands, children peeking from behind skirts. Some faces hardened, some softened. But most carried the uneasy look of those who sensed history nudging them forward, whether they wanted it or not. Toka dismounted first, his boots landing softly in dust that still bore traces of yesterday's violence. He did not stand before Clara or behind her. He stood beside her, hands empty, gaze steady. The constable stepped out from the church steps, shoulders tense, badge polished as if that alone gave him authority. "We don't need outsiders stirring things," he warned, voice too loud. Toka did not react to the tone, only the meaning. "You stirred your own," he replied. Clara stepped forward then, heart hammering but voice steady. "You punished me because you believed fear made you right." The crowd shifted, murmurs rippling. Before anyone could answer, Toka raised his voice, not shouting, simply letting it carry the way truth does when it refuses to bend. "She found me trapped like a wolf, bleeding into snow. She freed me with her hands, not knowing if I would harm or bless." Several townspeople flinched, unused to hearing their violence named alongside her mercy. Toka reached into a leather pouch and pulled something small, carved from bone and marked with black-painted symbols, its edges polished smooth by handling, not decoration. "This is a life token," he said. "When a life is taken, it marks debt. When a life is saved, it marks honor. Rarely is it given to one who stands outside our fires." He stepped forward and held it out to Clara, not offering it like a gift to be received, but presenting it like a truth to be recognized. Clara stared at it, breath catching. "If I take that, they'll say I belong to your people." "If you refuse," Toka said gently, "they will say you regret doing what was right." His voice softened, enough that only those nearest heard the next words. "This token does not claim, it remembers." Clara reached out, fingers brushing the carved bone as if touching something sacred. A hush spread across the yard, not reverent but stunned. When she closed her hand around it, Toka stepped back, not claiming her, not standing closer, simply allowing space for her to stand on her own feet, under her own name. One of the men who'd struck her yesterday shoved forward, face red, voice cracking. "So what now? We just pretend she ain't betrayed us?" Clara turned calmly. "Your fear betrayed you. I didn't." Gasps rippled, some shocked, some approving. Then an unexpected figure stepped from the crowd, the gray-haired widow who baked bread for funerals and births alike. She looked Clara in the eyes and whispered, "I saw the whip. It wasn't justice." Her voice shook as she spoke louder. "We punished her because she acted brave when we acted afraid." More faces softened, more fists lowered. The constable tried one last time to hold control. "These people don't belong here." Toka met his gaze, unwavering. "We leave now, but truth stays." He gave a final nod to Clara, then to the gathered settlers, an acknowledgement without surrender, and he and his warriors mounted their horses in fluid motions. They rode out not as victors, not as conquerors, but as witnesses departing a story they refused to let be twisted. Dust rose behind them like a closing curtain. Clara stood alone in the yard where she'd bled, but this time she stood upright, token in hand, scars uncovered in full daylight. No one spoke for a long moment, and then, quietly, Almost reluctantly, people stepped back to give her space, not because they suddenly adored her, but because they finally saw her, not as a traitor, not as a warning, as someone who chose mercy and survived it. Clara didn't follow the warriors when they left town. Instead, she walked slowly toward the edge of the square, letting the townsfolk disperse around her like water breaking around a rock, everyone pretending they had errands to run so they wouldn't have to decide whether to look at her or away. The token rested in her palm, warm from her skin, its carved symbols pressing faint indentations into her fingers, as if asking to be carried, not hidden. She tucked it gently into the small inner pocket of her shawl, right over her heart, not as allegiance, but as memory. She might have slipped away to the creek again, but the sharp crack of splintering wood stopped her mid-step. A door slammed open across the street, and out stumbled the same man who'd wielded the whip, the scar-lipped farmhand, his face red with drink and humiliation. "You think you're a hero now?" he shouted at no one and everyone. "Town turned soft 'cause a pack of savages ride in here and bow to her?" He staggered into the street, boots scraping gravel. If she hadn't stuck her nose where it didn't belong, none of this would have happened. He might have been ranting into the wind, but his eyes found Clara with the directness of a wounded animal looking for someone to maul. She didn't step back. She didn't tremble. Her voice came low, steady. "If you regret what you did, regret it. Don't blame me for living through it." He snapped like a struck match. "You think pain makes you righteous?" he snarled. "You ain't special." He reached for his holster, not fast, not sure, just drunk and stupid enough to reach. And the crowd gasped, mothers pulling children behind skirts, men stiffening but not rushing forward because the town had always been slow to stop the very violence it tolerated. Before the pistol cleared leather, the gray-haired widow stepped between them, arms spread, breath shaking. "Stop this," she pleaded. "We've done enough wrong already." The man shoved her aside with a rough hand, and that sealed his fate. From the edge of the crowd, the real sheriff, who'd avoided the whipping entirely yesterday, stepped forward at last, badge polished, but voice quiet. "Put the gun down, Caleb," Caleb sneered. "You ain't stopped me before." The sheriff's hand hovered over his own weapon, but what changed the air wasn't law. It was the sound of hooves approaching from the ridge again, steady, deliberate, unmistakable. The warriors returned, not in formation, not as a show of strength, but as witnesses to whatever ending this moment demanded. Toka rode at the front, dismounted before anyone else spoke, and didn't reach for a weapon. He just stepped into the street, gaze heavy with disappointment rather than threat. "You strike women when they save lives," he said, voice like dry thunder. "You strike elders when they stand between you and your shame." Caleb's hands shook, his pistol clattered to the ground, not because he feared dying, but because he finally understood how small he looked. The sheriff moved then, too late, but moving still, shoving Caleb to his knees and yanking the gun away. The crowd exhaled as though a storm cloud had finally broken. Clara watched, arms limp at her sides, no triumph in her face, only a tired, quiet ache. Toka turned, speaking not to Caleb but to the town. "We do not take him. He is yours, but choose who you are when no one forces you." He stepped back, letting the settlers decide their own justice. The sheriff pulled Caleb to his feet, jaw tight. "You'll be leaving town," he said, "before sundown." Caleb looked around, seeking allies. None stepped forward, not even the ones who had cheered his lash strokes the day before. He spat once at the dirt, then limped toward the livery, shoulders hunched in the shrinking posture of a man finally seen clearly. Clara watched him go with no satisfaction, just relief that the cycle of violence would not become hers to carry. The sheriff turned to her. "He won't trouble you again." Clara nodded once. "Good. But keep watch over the ones who cheered him. They're quieter, but they're not harmless." She walked past him then, past the crowd, past the broken pistol in the dust, and the town parted again, not in fear, but in something closer to recognition. Behind her, the warriors remounted. Ahead of her, the hills waited like open doors, and for the first time, justice didn't feel like vengeance. It felt like a wound finally allowed to close. By late afternoon, the light softened into a pale, steady gold that stretched across the hills like a quiet surrender, And Clara found herself walking the same creekside trail where she had washed her wounds, only this time her steps weren't driven by escape or shame. They carried the slow confidence of someone returning to ground that no longer demanded excuses. The token rested warm inside her shawl, not displayed, not hidden, just held close the way truth settles once the world stops arguing with it. Toka rode beside her until the trees opened into a small clearing where the grass bent under the weight of recent hoofprints. He dismounted, tying his horse to a low branch, and the remaining warriors waited at the tree line rather than surrounding her, their posture relaxed and quiet, like witnesses drawing back so a moment could breathe. Clara sat on a fallen log, back straight despite the sting across her shoulders, and watched water glide over smooth stone. "You'll leave again," she said, not as accusation, but as fact. Toka nodded once. "Our path is long," she traced the earth with her boot. "I don't know what happens now." His voice carried the simple honesty she'd come to rely on. "You live, they learn, or they do not." She laughed softly, surprised by how unbroken it sounded. "You make things sound simple." "They are not," he said, "but truth walks straighter than fear." Silence settled between them, warm rather than heavy. The breeze shifted, carrying the scent of pine and distant smoke. Someone in town cooking supper, someone living their ordinary life without realizing how close they had come to losing it to cruelty. Clara closed her eyes for a moment, letting peace seep in where pain had lived. When she opened them, Toka had placed something beside her on the log, a small bundle wrapped in soft hide tied with a single braided cord. She hesitated. "What is this?" "Not a claim," he said. "A path." She untied it slowly, revealing a carved cradleboard frame, small, unfinished, light enough for a newborn. The breath left her chest. "Why give me this?" "Because someday you will carry life," he said. "Child of yours or child of the world, and you should carry without fear." Her throat tightened, tears knotting somewhere deep, not for children or promises, but for the simple belief that she still had a future. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know what I'll do with it." "You will know when it is time." He stood, stepping back, giving space without ceremony. "We ride at dusk." Clara rose as well, meeting his gaze. "If you ever need help again," she said quietly, "I won't look away." A faint, almost smile touched his expression, not pride, not triumph, just recognition. "You never did." He lifted his hand in a gesture that was neither farewell nor greeting, something older than both, and she mirrored it without needing instruction. The warriors turned their horses as the sun dipped lower, hooves whispering through grass. Toka mounted last, pausing long enough to speak without turning. "Walk in light, stand where your truth does." Then they rode, silhouettes stretching long across the prairie until distance folded their shapes into the land itself. Clara stayed by the water until shadows lengthened and air cooled. Then she walked back toward the town, not to belong, but to live on her own terms. The token pressed against her heart with each step, steady as breath. Some wounds aren't meant to be forgotten, they're meant to be carried until someone else learns from them. If Clara's courage spoke to you, tell me below. Would you have helped a stranger the world called dangerous? Like, share, and subscribe for more Redemption West stories, where mercy walks in daylight and every soul deserves a second sunrise.